Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to Manny Super Civic Cyber Conversations. It is 6 p.m. on a Thursday. I'm ready for the weekend. I don't know if you are. So today we have a very interesting conversation. We are going to be discussing safety first, improving hazard resilience in the Bay Area. And we are joined by two lovely ladies, Laura Tam and Julia Lurie. And they're going to be taking over this conversation to discuss the issues that I just mentioned. But before that, I want to do a little plug for Manning's. So as many of you know, a lot of businesses have closed across the city. So we are moving our programming to our, the virtual realm. Nonetheless, if you want to support Manny's and keep donating, make sure that you go to the link that's right in the chat box. And if you have $1 or $2, please feel free to donate that to us. So Julia, Laura, I'm gonna let you take away.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia. I'm a senior reporter at Mother Jones Magazine. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Tam. I am currently at Resources Legacy Fund, but for the last 12 years, I was a policy director at SPUR, where I worked on this paper that we're going to talk about and the topic that we're going to talk about today.
That's an excellent segue. So I think my first question is just like, given the time that we're in right now, when people hear about hazards, they probably think health hazards, pandemics. What are the hazards that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, I mean, I think we can't talk about the ones that we wrote this paper about without acknowledging the present one that we're in right now in all of its devastation and the way that it's touching all of our lives, which is common to, I'm sure, communities that have experienced the type of disasters that we talk about in our report, Safety First, which include earthquakes, wildfires, and flooding primarily, but we do acknowledge some of the other challenges of climate change that are likely to occur in the future that are also going to be experienced as disasters by the communities that experience them, such as high heat, drought, and other impacts. So we can't, of course, today we can't talk about just those hazards that impact our physical environment in the way that we talk about them in this paper and that many of our recommendations are cued to, without acknowledging COVID-19 and the impact it's having on so many communities around us and our own lives. But actually some of the recommendations that we make around disaster recovery and preparing for the unknown are coming into focus right now, and we're being tested as we speak. Things that we will probably, hopefully, be able to put to use in the future as we experience the sort of natural disasters or hazards that we talk about in this paper.
Great. So what are some of the ways in which, I mean, this paper that you wrote for SPUR is online and it's actually a fascinating read, so I would recommend it to folks who are interested in this. But I'm wondering if you can walk us through some of the ways in which cities or counties have already prepared for the hazards that you're talking about that might surprise or comfort residents who live there.
Yes. So as I said, we talk at SPUR very often about what we can do to improve our built environment, our land use planning, our ways of delivering recovery and resilience, that ways they could be improved. But there are also things that are going well, and we actually have a bead on some of the ways that we can improve our built environment, and we can improve our readiness for any sort of earthquake or climate-driven disaster in the future. I would say that we do have some overarching sort of architecture of disaster preparedness that we get from the federal government, that the state provides for us. Cities and counties have to prepare general plans that have safety parts of them. Most of them have hazard mitigation plans that contemplate how to prepare for and what to do about disasters that are, commonly experienced in California. But some of the more innovative ways that we would like to highlight that we highlight in the paper and that we could talk about more here too, that are, we have some innovative practices that are not shared by every local government in the Bay Area. Some cities and counties are doing more than others to be ready for the disasters that we face with climate change or for an earthquake. And I can share some examples if you like.
That'd be great.
One of the, I'll just back up for just a second just to say that one of the theses of this paper, and that is very important for us to all keep in mind, is that, and I would actually say we are experiencing and living through with COVID-19 and coronavirus as well, is that our resilience or our safety is bound up in the actions of not just the jurisdiction that we live in, but those around us. And we're seeing, for example, in the Bay Area, how public health officers and school districts and mayors are collaborating with each other to advance shared policies or ideas and timing around how to respond to coronavirus. That's the kind of thing we advocate for and recommend creating the architecture for and infrastructure for in this paper, because what one community does to protect itself from a pandemic, what one community does to prepare itself for an earthquake and recovering from an earthquake affects the resilience of everyone around it. Sometimes quite literally in the sense of, for example, a county or a neighborhood fire district that has done a lot of excellent vegetation management might be quite resilient, but if a fire starts in a nearby, in the same connected regional forest nearby in an area that has not done excellent vegetation management, that fire spreads and could put many more at risk. Likewise, on flood resiliency, if you build a enhanced seawall to protect yourself from sea level rise, you can reflect that wave energy and create flooding in another part of the Bay Area when you're protecting yourself from it. So we're all connected. We're an interconnected region, an interconnected economy, and we have to react in an interconnected way to preparing for the future disasters and specifically about climate change. I don't know if that was the question you just asked, but that's where I went. Some examples.
Yeah, there are some unintended consequences, though, it sounds like, of things that sound like good solutions that may not be. But yeah, maybe before we get there, what are some examples of places that you think are doing things well?
I'll give an example. Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland, and I think Fremont have requirements that all buildings that have what is called a soft story condition, which is where the ground floor is kind of open. Usually it's retail or parking, be retrofitted, because this is a very vulnerable building type to collapsing in an earthquake, which we saw in the marina after Loma Prieta in 1989. Especially in the marina, because that's where there are a lot of soils that are more vulnerable to having buildings collapse, but also because of the building type that is there. So those cities have a requirement that those buildings be retrofit by a time certain. I don't remember what year it is, but they need to come into compliance. They also paired these requirements with financing assistance to help homeowners and landlords to retrofit their buildings. But that's one example of something that is important to maintain our building stock to be safely habitable after an earthquake. And it is something that other cities should copy. I'll give you another example of San Mateo County is doing a really good job thinking about resiliency to flooding and sea level rise. It is one of the more exposed counties in the Bay Area because it has both the Pacific coast and a San Francisco Bay shoreline. but it has established a county-wide resiliency district that is taking into account flood control measures throughout the county that go beyond areas that are currently susceptible to flooding, and thinks about and includes areas that may be susceptible to future flooding and planning for sea level rise. So they've done a lot of community education work and vulnerability assessment work to understand their vulnerability to sea level rise and to plan together to take action to do something about it.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I feel like it's very refreshing right now to hear about places that are thinking way ahead of the game, because like we're in a time where it feels like all the cracks in the system are being exposed, and all the things that we should have prepared for before are being exposed. So it's really nice to hear about places that are planning for the future. I'm wondering, so you just talked about like things that might come for people that counties have done and cities have done. I'm wondering if you can talk about the flip side, like things that cities and counties in the Bay Area have not yet done that might worry residents who live there.
Yes, well, a couple of things. I don't want to worry people too much. I mean, it's true that like there are ways in which we're deeply underprepared for all of these crises, and I think people know because we've experienced, the Bay Area is no stranger to natural hazards. We've had big earthquakes, we've had flooding, we've had wildfires, especially recently, that are very present in people's minds. So I'll just say a couple of things that could be better, which is that, you know, many communities don't have a requirement to retrofit, and this is something we recommend in our report, to retrofit older buildings. So what people may not know, two things. One, the building code that sort of maintains safety in the built environment is designed to keep people from dying in a building collapsing after an earthquake. It is not designed to help protect the contents of those buildings or to maintain habitability after an earthquake occurs. So we have a lot of buildings that were built to building codes that were, you know, the state of the art at the time, but now they're old buildings and we know that they're subject to potential, maybe not collapse, but certainly being unusable after an event. And that can affect people, especially people who are renters, who don't have anywhere else to go. It can also affect businesses and their ability to recover after an earthquake. So we don't have anywhere that's requiring, other than these soft story retrofit ordinances that I mentioned, a systematic review of vulnerability in the built environment to prepare old buildings to not fall down and collapse after an earthquake, so that they're ready to use. So we call that earthquake, people call that a recoverable building standard, and it's something we should have. Another thing that we're not doing is just generally enough to prepare for climate change related high heat events. We do have in some cities, they're trying to plant trees, we're trying to build green infrastructure to manage stormwater, but it's not scaled up at the level that would help to reduce heat in the built environment. We don't have a lot of heat response plans necessarily. I don't want to say anything negative about the Bay Area public health officers because they're doing an amazing job right now during coronavirus. Yeah. But I think that in the future, we're going to have more hospital visitation and other things associated with heat waves. There was a study that was done, and there was a heat wave in 2006 where an interesting study was done that showed that even while places like the Central Valley were objectively hotter during this particular heat wave, there was more emergency room visitation in the Bay Area because our built environment does not, our bodies are not ready for extreme high heat, and our built environment is not supplied with air conditioning. Less than 10% of housing in Marin, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties has access to air conditioning. So that's just another thing, like the built environment is not ready for the change of weather that we're going to have as climate happens. And then finally, just on sea level rise, because I've worked on that issue for so long, we are running out of time to save marshes like the one that's in my background here, to help prepare our sort of natural infrastructure for readying for future sea level rise and storm events. And so we have only until about 2030, scientists say, to ready our shorelines and marshes to withstand the increasing rate of sea level rise that will occur in the future. So we really have to figure out how to get out in front, to sort of restore and rebuild the wetlands that we've lost around San Francisco Bay, to be ready to give us a multi-benefit and natural form of flood protection before sea levels rise 1 to 3 feet starting in the middle of the century.
The thought being that marshes and wetlands help reduce sea level rise potentially by being a natural flood barrier.
Yeah, they don't necessarily reduce sea level rise, but they help buffer us from sea level rise while also providing important habitat for plants and animals.
Before I ask you another question, I would just say to folks who are listening, if you have questions, definitely feel free to post them in the Q&A section, and I will go through them in just a few minutes. One thing that I think we're seeing now, definitely with coronavirus, is that you know, this crisis is really highlighting the existing disparities in our communities. If you're poor, it's a lot harder to socially distance yourself, or to work from home, or to, you know, maybe access healthcare if you get sick. I'm wondering if you can talk about the ways in which one would expect the natural disasters that you're talking about, floods, earthquakes, how those might magnify existing disparities.
Yes, unfortunately, it's true that those who are already people of low income, or people who are older or very young or already have pre-existing health conditions are more vulnerable to natural disasters. They're more likely to suffer from poor air quality resulting from wildfires or high heat days. They're more likely to live in housing that may not have been retrofit for any kind of disaster. They may be underinsured. There are certainly, while every part of the Bay Area is subject to a constellation of different hazards, and you can look at the maps that we provided in this report, looking at where flooding is likely, where wildfires occur, and where earthquake-related hazards can occur, including liquefaction and landslides. Those who live in more vulnerable communities will be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change, and are least likely to be able to recover quickly from a disaster. So they require special attention, care, and resources to become prepared for climate and to become resilient. Many community members in vulnerable places have limited access to resources. Housing affordability, as we all know, is an existing challenge in the Bay Area that is aggravated by climate risk. Renters, as I said, sorry?
Can you talk about what you mean by that? I don't think most people think of housing affordability as associated with climate risk.
Oh, well, many housing is already very expensive in the Bay Area, as I'm sure we all know. And so many people are already very cost burdened by their housing requirements, meaning that they spend more than 20% or 30% of their income on housing, which leaves them less able to have, a storage, like a stock of resources to be prepared to move after a disaster. If their housing is damaged, they may be less likely to be able to find something new, because it's very hard to find, especially if they have rent-controlled housing. Like moving out of rent-controlled housing into non-rent-controlled housing would be very challenging for people of limited means, or who've been expecting to be paying a certain amount for housing over time. And we just have an overall incredible lack of affordable housing in the Bay Area. And so with the shortage that we have, people who are more vulnerable to housing displacement and other things are more vulnerable to a crisis that affects buildings that house people.
Okay, I'm going to jump to some of the questions because there are some very good ones. From a listener named Zach. He says, can you talk about opportunities to combine building climate resiliency with reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Oh, I would love to talk about that. I'll probably forget some of the ways because there's so many ways that these things are tied. But I'll just say that, like, yes, there are so many ways that greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced through climate resilience measures, and climate resilience measures can help to reduce GHG. So for one example, shifting to different modes of travel can make us walking, biking, and transit can make us obviously make a big reduction in emissions. Transportation is the fastest growing source of emissions in the United States and in California and in the Bay Area. But there's those modes also, if we open up streets and we make more public space available to people who are using other modes, and we make transit work better, we have subjected people less to the need to buy expensive gasoline. I guess that might be changing right now, but that's one thing. Another thing is, as I mentioned, the ways that we can reduce heat in cities include planting trees and green infrastructure, things that store carbon, that help to mitigate flood risk. Planting wetlands, restoring wetlands is actually a really large carbon sink. That's very important. And that helps to both provide the sort of flood risk reduction benefits, and it stores carbon as well. I'm trying to think of other things. Forestry, public land management is also another opportunity there. There are promising practices in forestry and in agriculture that help to sequester carbon in the soil, or that use thinning and treatment for wildfires, a way of generating renewable energy. So those are just a couple of things, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some because there's so many connections that that connect, becoming a more carbon resilient environment with climate resiliency.
I mean, yeah, and like those are a lot that you just said.
You might have some other examples, Julia. I'm sure I'm blanking on a couple.
I'm thinking of like the in your report you talk about I forget exactly what you called it, like the wild urban, basically like the part of the land use area that is most quickly growing right now is this like transitional area between wild spaces and urban spaces. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because that's exactly related to what this question was about.
Yes, the wildland urban interface is the area that is between, or also known as the WUI, which is like a weird acronym to pronounce. Doesn't sound totally normal, but the WUI is the area between urbanized areas and forested areas where density is kind of low, and is the fastest growing area of development in the United States. It's really grown significantly in the last 20 years, and it's the area that is not only where more damages or risk can occur of people who are living there when there's a wildfire, but it's also the area where there are more ignitions, so more likely to start a wildfire in this area. And it's an area that not every city has not every urban area has a wildland urban interface. San Francisco doesn't have much of one, but it's an area where better land use policy and resources to support home hardening, vegetation management, and other risk reduction measures is really, really critical. One of the most important risk reduction measures we can take is to not permit additional development that expands a low density suburban environment into these areas that are already of high fire risk, because that's one of the ways that you put future residents in more danger, and you have to extend the line that you have to defend in terms of defensible space in a wildfire. So providing resources to help existing residents improve their building resilience to wildfire in those areas is really important. also requiring it. It shouldn't just be incentivized. It should be required that those homes are readier for a wildfire. Providing resources for vegetation management is something that public resources could support. And then finally, just holding the line and trying to bring development into existing urbanized areas that are walkable, that provide transportation options that are more sustainable in the first place, is a way of preventing future damages and future misery.
Okay, a couple questions from Alyssa named Sanaya. Sanaya, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly. If we could gather data and put it to use to be more resilient in the future, what would those key factors or data points that we should look out for be?
That's an interesting question. So what data are we missing to better understand, if I'm getting this right, Julia,
maybe what
data are we missing to better understand our position with respect to resilience and what we need to do still?
Yeah, or even are we already collecting that are really important to keep collecting and be looking at? I think either way.
That's an interesting question. I think one of the challenges that we have not done such a good job of is we do not have very dynamic web-based map that reflect future risk for climate disasters, for lack of a better term. We have, our flood maps are based on historic areas that flood. Our fire maps are based on surveyed fire risk that does not change even though the wildland-urban interface is expanding all the time. Earthquake science is changing all the time. So we don't have dynamic web-based maps that a property owner can go to and look up. What are the hazards that I face and what can I do to be better informed? I think we make a recommendation in this report along those lines. That is something the state could do using existing technologies, including perhaps even AI, although I am not an expert in that area. I've seen some interesting applications where AI could be used to better integrate an understanding of what hazards in any one place are in order to identify improvements that could be made. But I will also say that in some cases we've done a really good job trying to collect and understand data about what could be done. I'll just point to a recent effort by a publicly funded effort by the organization that is in the state agency that is in charge of managing the Bay shoreline of San Francisco Bay. Bay Conservation and Development Commission just released a really big report called Adapting to Rising Tides that looks very, very up close at what exact places are going to be at risk and what infrastructure is going to be at risk of future flooding in the Bay Area, and then makes recommendations about what could be done. We also have another product that we worked on, a report with the San Francisco Estuary Institute that was released in 2019 that's called the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas. And in that, we use all kinds of data to point out what green infrastructure or nature-based solutions we can use for the shoreline to help better prepare wetlands and San Francisco Bay for nature-based adaptation. So those are a couple of applications where we do have some good information, and a lot of hard work went into both those reports, I can tell you, but we need to do more because the hazards are expanding into places where we may not have expected them before.
So it sounds like part of the answer is using the data points that we already think of, like fire lines and flood maps, that kind of thing, but making them dynamic and making them up to date so that we can actually see those in real time rather than relying on historical data.
Yes, I think that we can't use the past as a good predictor of where the hazards may be in the future necessarily.
Yeah.
Scenario planning is one of the things that can be. I'll just say one quick thing. USGS also did a scenario planning exercise around a major earthquake on Hayward Fault, which runs through the East Bay, and they found that the damages and impacts from that, just running a model, were helpful in making predictions about not making predictions, but making recommendations about what policies are needed in order to provide a safer environment for a major earthquake in the Bay.
Yeah. Last question. is kind of broad, but a great question, and also kind of relates to COVID. What are some things that we can do to activate our communities in the aftermath of a natural disaster?
Oh,
I had a feeling that that one would cause a bit of a pause because there are a lot of things.
yeah. I mean, I wish we were having like a broader in-room conversation because I feel like other
Yeah.
people may have equally valid or better answers to this than I do. But I mean, there's certainly a lot of the actions that we're seeing people taking right now, following public health orders, social distancing in the streets, providing support to neighbors. I've noticed there's a lot of neighborhood coalitions coming together where people are like delivering groceries to neighbors who need it. There's informal networks of people who have come together online. Internet has been an amazing tool for disaster recovery, actually. People are coming together to provide support to those who need it. And this can translate into advocacy, effective advocacy at the local level. There have certainly been some safer, better streets advocates here in San Francisco who have observed what is happening in Oakland around slow streets and have created a climate of urgency for creating some of those in San Francisco. And we're getting a couple of them, or we're getting a few more of them than we had. And maybe that will roll out even at an even greater level across the city. At least I'm hoping that that happens. As a place for people to recreate and walk and bike safely, especially in neighborhoods that don't have ready access to the big parks, which are the only parks that are open anymore. So I think some of those ways that people are coming together around advocacy and supporting each other is going to be exactly what we're going to need in a natural disaster or an unnatural disaster in the case of climate change. And I'll point out there was a really beautiful story, very sad story actually, that was reported by KQED last year or 2 years ago by Molly Peterson as the reporter. She talked about the heat wave and neighbors checking on each other in San Francisco and how it wasn't effective enough, and a woman really tragically lost her life. And so calling for sort of like neighborhood brigades for people to wrap around people who are more vulnerable and provide them with support.
And it sounds also like there's been a lot of inter-county working together as well. In addition to people on the ground, neighbors and that kind of thing working together, there's also been counties with a lot of communication in how to respond to this.
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the beginning, I think that the coronavirus response among cities and counties in the Bay Area has been I mean, obviously it's a tragic and horrible situation, but the response has been really encouraging for what we might do after a future earthquake or after a future wildfire, being ready to respond with enough personal protective equipment for everyone when we need, when we're experiencing a smoke event. But reaching out and being more dramatic about, or not being more dramatic, but being even more, providing those resources for less cost in vulnerable communities to vulnerable populations, doing the outreach in multiple languages as we're seeing with the public health orders, and the school districts providing distance learning in multiple languages, something they weren't doing in school so necessarily. So I feel like some of the seeds of hope we're seeing it in the coronavirus response, and hopefully those things that went well will translate into any future disaster that we face. And also preparing, one of the main messages of this report and that I'd like to share is just, we want to be resilient. We couldn't have predicted that. Well, I guess some people did predict this pandemic, but we know that these disasters are coming. They're not unpredictable. We can be better prepared to mitigate the worst damages beforehand, so that recovery is very important, but so is being resilient in the first place. And there's a lot we can still do to prepare our communities and our infrastructure and our cities.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a nice note to end on.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Julia. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to both Julia from Mother Jones, and thank you, Laura, for sharing about all the wonderful policy work that you're doing over at SPUR. It was very informative, and most importantly, thank you to everyone that watched. You can catch this conversation on our YouTube channel. Nonetheless, I also want to do one final plug to donate to Manny's. If you're able to, nonetheless, we appreciate all your participation. Julia, Laura, thank you once again for joining us, for taking time to do so. And I hope you had fun.
Thanks, I did. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you,
Thanks for
everyone.
having us, Jupiter and Manny.
Of course, thank you. And I'll see you in the real world.
Okay, excellent.
Look forward to it.
Everyone.